The German leader would apply pressure to get what he wanted, but unless he was provoked, Hitler would stop short of actual war. Surrounded by men who dared not question his judgment, Stalin would persist until the very end in believing that the German threat was no more than a gigantic bluff. The key to a German victory over Russia would be speed above all else. Hitler insisted that Soviet forces in the West would have to be defeated within 10 weeks of the start of the invasion. A complete German victory would have to be won within 17 weeks. The reason was not just the notorious Russian winter, but also the inescapable fact that there would only be enough fuel, ammunition and supplies for a quick and decisive campaign. Time was everything. From the start, German planners had to take account of a major natural obstacle which lay in the path of any direct thrust into the Soviet Union. The Pripyat Marshes was a vast area of swamps and forests, 150 miles long and 300 miles deep. It was expected that the Soviet defenders would be in two main concentrations, divided by the marshes, with a reserve around Moscow. The German offensive, codenamed Operation Otto, would be launched by 3 army groups, 2 of them to the north of the marshes and 1 to the south. Army Group Center would have the most important task, a drive straight towards Moscow, the hub of the Soviet system. Army Group North would push towards Leningrad, an important arms production center. Army Group South would attack towards Kiev, from southern Poland and from Romania. After all 3 army groups had pushed deep into the interior, the northern and southern groups would swing inwards to support Army Group Center for the final advance on the Soviet capital. The threat to Moscow would draw in the remnants of the Red Army and ensure their total destruction. Although the Army High Command had developed its plan over 4 painstaking months, testing and refining it with war games, Adolf Hitler was far from satisfied. Haunted by the fate of Napoleon, who had taken Moscow but failed to destroy the Russian army, he insisted that the Soviet capital was irrelevant. In early December, at a stroke, Hitler changed the entire emphasis of the campaign. His new plan was named Operation Barbarossa. Hitler insisted that the Red Army had to be destroyed west of a line linking the rivers Dnieper and Dwina. His plan was designed, above all else, to prevent the enemy from withdrawing into the interior. As before, Army Group North would strike towards Leningrad. Army Group Center would force a breakthrough towards Minsk and Smolensk. However, in the new plan, their main task would be to destroy the Red Army in the north. They would achieve this by 2 encirclement operations, one around Minsk and the second in the Baltic states. The Baltic offensive would culminate in the capture of Leningrad and give the Wehrmacht valuable ports to supply its offensive. Below the Pripyat marshes, Army Group South would make a single thrust towards the Dnieper at Kiev and would drive southeast along the river to prevent a Russian withdrawal. The Soviets would be attacked from the rear and annihilated. Army Group South would then push east towards the industrial Donetsk Basin and the oil fields of the Caucasus. Only after their great flanking operations had destroyed the bulk of the Red Army would the invaders turn their attention to the capture of Moscow. After the destruction of the reserve Russian armies and the fall of the Soviet capital, the next stage would be the establishment of a German defensive line stretching from Archangel to the River Volga. The last remaining industrial areas east of the Volga and beyond the Ural Mountains would now be in easy reach of the German Air Force and would be bombed into the ground. Without an industrial base, the Russians would be unable to mount an effective resistance for the foreseeable future. Operation Barbarossa depended for its success on the performance of the armoured formations which would spearhead every thrust. However, the men who led the Panzer Groups were already deeply unhappy with the plan. Heinz Guderian, the tactician who had done most to develop German armoured warfare, pleaded for a bolder stroke. The panzers, stripped to their fighting core and supplied by parachute drop, should race deep into the Soviet Union, perhaps even to Moscow, completely paralyzing the Russian defense. Mopping up could be left to the infantry following on behind. Hitler and his senior commanders, nearly all infantry and artillerymen by training, would have none of Guderian's plan. The panzers were to fight classic battles of encirclement, no deeper than a few hundred miles into the Soviet Union. In the early stages, the armour would even be controlled by infantry generals. The panzer leaders, Germany's greatest assets in its campaigns so far, would begin the most ambitious offensive in the Reich's history with their hands firmly tied. Since the start of the war in Europe, the Soviet Union had been building vast stockpiles of food, strategic metals, and oil. At the same time, an increasing proportion of Soviet industry was being located far to the east, in relative safety beyond the Urals. However, Stalin resolutely ignored advice to move the strategic stockpiles east as well. The disagreement was part of a larger dispute between Stalin and his military planners. Where should the forces defending the Soviet Union be deployed? On the western borders or deeper inside the Russian heartland? During the 1930s, the backbone of the Russian defense was the Stalin Line, a series of fortified areas.